Do color trends follow or even predict the economy? After all, we know that color, especially when it comes to the space we're in, can have an extreme effect on emotion. This room feels dramatically different from this room, or in this space, or even in this room. And I don't think I need to argue that the state of the economy also greatly affects not only our personal emotions, but has a larger societal sway as well. So maybe, just maybe, there's a pattern we can find here. Now, I'll be the first to say I generally don't believe that we can predict the economy based on fashion trends. Heel heights, skirt lengths, jean shapes, none of those actually match up with any economic graphs. It may be because those aren't actually tied to emotions, or because there's extremely practical reasons why super high heels or mini skirts will never be the only option, even if they are a sometimes option for some people. But after the announcement of the colors of the year received extremely emotional pushback, and it's not the first year that that's happened, it got me wondering. After all, the other color palettes that paint and decor companies released were embraced much more heartily. And spoiler alert, the 2026 color trends are almost directly the 1926 color trends. I'm not sure if that's an omen, to be honest, but that's what I want to figure out. Do our economic rises and falls have cultural impacts that guide the rise and fall of, I don't know, chartreuse? Does the popularity of fuchsia herald a war? Or maybe turquoise predicts a stock market crash? What can color tell us about how we, as a society, are feeling about our future? First up, our control group. These are the predicted palettes for this year. Aside from the constant of neutrals, moving beige from blue to yellow to pink undertones, there's a lot of softer greens, roses, rusts, and even plums. It's not an aggressive palette, but it's not entirely neutral. I'm choosing to stick with this format for analysis because it's something that I can find examples of with precise dates. Paint color brochures, books, and cards have been around since the 19th century and are a great way to see what the overarching common styles were, especially when paints didn't come standard with a selection of dozens of colors like today. It's certainly not all-inclusive, and there are plenty of variations and subsets that won't be part of this. The same analysis could also be done with any emotional and cultural option: music, art, dance, even cars. I have a feeling they'd all come out a little differently. But looking at interior paint options has definitely resulted in, well, something, as you'll see. We know that the colors that surround us play a huge role in our emotional state. Movies use this to great effect with color grading or even saturating entire scenes in one tone, like the ever-famous Emerald City, which, if you are looking for a way to immerse yourself in a world of color and style, look no further than the sponsor for today's video, June's Journey. June's Journey is a hidden object game that follows clever sleuth June Parker in solving the mystery of her sister's murder and uncovering the family secrets. All set in the world of the 1920s and beautifully illustrated to capture the vibrancy of the era. Of course, like all good research, one mystery solved always seems to lead to another, and June keeps getting caught up in exciting and perilous situations on her journey with her friends. As you discover clues in each new place, the story unfolds, revealing mysterious characters, shocking secrets, and adventure. On top of all of this, you get to build up the island with gardens, houses, shops, and more. From now until the end of January, you can even immerse yourself in the wonderful world of Oz. With special locations, decor, and rewards from Wicked, it makes the game even more magical. I do think that the Ozian forest would go perfectly in my botanical garden. I found it perfect to pick up for a few minutes here and there throughout the day to take a break from all of the work around the house I've been doing. It's so satisfying to complete the scenes and extra challenges, all within such a lovely Art Deco world. Download June's Journey for free and uncover hidden treasures from Oz in a world of enchanting mystery. Just go to the link in the description or scan my QR code. And thanks again to June's Journey for sponsoring this video. Qualifying the economy as good or bad is pretty much impossible. Even today, when it feels terrible to most people, you'll still hear that the numbers look good. Measures of the economy tend to be checking for how banks, large businesses, and even the government is doing. We can measure by GDP, gross domestic product, looking at how much export we put out each year. But that's also adjusted by how much import, which shifts wildly in times of war or tariffs. It also is more a marker of how much money larger companies are making. We can look at inflation, but that's gone through so many major changes in the government's attempt to control it at this point. It's both a response and a cause. Trust in banks and trust in government can also make us feel differently about the economy, and those aren't really measured directly. Even the relative price of bread isn't helpful here. It changes so much. I remember back in the 1990s, the news would talk about whether middle-class families were traveling by plane or road tripping for their summer vacation as a way to track how people were doing. I don't feel like that carried through to modern day. So instead of trying to map out a graph, let's look at some of the major moments throughout the 20th century that may have had impacts on our social stability. Things that we know left people, or more specifically, the American middle class, feeling insecure. I'm pinpointing that group because, as we talked about with Pantone, where the very wealthy are may be completely separate in both trends and emotions. And as we get into colors, that is the group that is being advertised to throughout that century. Heading all the way back to the 1900s, the decade was relatively stable compared to where we are headed. There was the Panic of 1907, which was sort of a mini stock market crash that was righted as JP Morgan stepped in after about 3 weeks and got a bunch of other wealthy people to dump money in to shore up banks and stocks, stabilizing things enough to avoid disaster. More of an economic dip on the graph than an emotional one. But things were still changing in terms of new inventions, social life, and homes. The color palette for this decade is muted, meaning more gray is added to dull the vivid colors regardless of how light or dark. Light green, sunshine, pink, rose, and mere tints of color. It's not just neutrals, as there are plenty of popular colors, but paint leans lighter overall, which makes sense as dark and heavy woodwork was also common. Warm red and mural green, along with the variety of old rose tones, do balance the scale, however. I did come across a few articles mentioning the oncoming bright or even garish color schemes in home decor near the end of the decade, so there may be a slow shift away from these tempered tones. Overall, it doesn't tell us much on its own. I would assume a calmer decade is tied to calmer colors, but we'll have to see how long that lasts. Especially since the 19-teens is anything but calm. Even just looking at how fashion changes suddenly across the years implies that people were aggressively seeking out novelty. Obviously, the Great War officially began in 1914 and had a major impact, but there was a buildup of tension for 5 or 6 years before that. Maybe the rise of military spending and the rise in those bright colors are related. The war ended in 1918, it was followed by years of trying to bring back a sense of peace and normalcy. Inflation hit the US during the war on a scale that was not sustainable, and there were arguments over how to bring prices back down in tandem with income. Raw goods, including food, were heavily impacted. The Spanish flu followed right on the heels of battle. The war did bring about all sorts of amazing advancements in technology, but it's understandable how that could seem overwhelming rather than positive at the time. To be honest, this is one of the most chaotic decades in the entire century. People responded not just with changes in fashion, but tons of protests, picket lines, and community organization. Restless emotions led to physical examples of that. When it comes to color schemes, however, it's not a stark difference. Things do get a little brighter. Shell pink, pea green, lavender, and primrose. The dark woodwork is finding a new rival in white or lighter woodwork trims as well, though that's just in newer homes for the most part. I feel like the light tones are very similar, just a little clearer. The dark colors have spread out to include a much wider range of greens and rusts in the common palette: terracotta, olive, maroon, and delft blue. Vibrant grassy greens that may have been an occasional accent in 1908 are now covering the walls in 1918. But it's far from being a whiplash of color indicative of cultural instability, more like a slow advancement towards a different style. I did wonder if perhaps the war and inflation almost held back what could have been a more aggressive switch in color palettes, but painting the house inside or out is considered as much a form of maintenance as it is style. The walls get dingy with smoke from the fireplace or coal and oil heating systems. Cleanliness was a huge concern that did help push forward things like white painted trim, so refreshing paint that was past the point of an easy clean would still have been a priority. Maybe not completely replacing the living room furniture, but reupholstering would have been economical enough. All to say that I don't think, at least in the earlier portion of the century, updating color schemes in the home every 10 years or so was as much of a luxury as we would deem it now. However, if that is the case that depressed periods of economy slow the forward momentum of style changes, we can expect to see alternating speeds or at least delayed shifts. And with that, we move on to the 1920s. This decade starts and ends with the Depression. The post-war inflation took a few years to smooth out, while we colloquially know this as the Roaring Twenties and assume it was an extremely affluent and wild decade. That's really a very small subset of the population that experienced it that way. Yes, there was a lot of social progress in many ways, and the younger generation was therefore freer than those before them, able to go on dates to movies, amusement parks, dancing, and the like without repercussions. But it wasn't an era with a showering of wealth or even stability. It was a reaction to the feeling that nothing is guaranteed, nothing lasts forever, and things could go sideways at any time. Even flappers, the epitome of what we think of as 1920s, was really a 1918 to barely 1924 phenomenon that was just a small group of young women, no different than any other fashionable subtype today that honestly got made fun of more than it was participated in. Not common, and certainly not reflective of the social state in general. The color palette of the decade is a little bit cleaner than before. It still leans towards lighter tones on the walls, but with complex color palettes for textiles and decor. Similar tones to what was popular prior, with rose, pink, lavender, ochre, jade, and sky blue persisting. They may be just a little darker, a little brighter, and more likely to be paired with contrasting colors. On the darker side, burgundy and forest green are still popular. They're just spread out a bit to include the mulberry to terracotta range and the olive to turquoise range. Essentially, the colors themselves aren't strikingly novel, but the color blocking, complex palettes, and geometric designs make them feel much stronger. I've talked at length about the decor styles of this decade before, but the refresh of color does fit with both the style goals and social needs of the time. It wasn't throwing out everything and starting over. It was collecting up the broken bits and trying to form something stronger that would carry into a new era. Economically distrustful, but there was potential on the horizon. Well, kind of. Obviously, the economy stretched further than it could sustain, and the banks took excessive risks without a safety net. And another stock market dip was not saved by JP Morgan this time. The crash of 1929 would lead to job loss on a dramatic scale, families' entire savings being lost, and an extreme distrust in the system. The Dust Bowl was set off in 1930 and continued to get worse over the decade, with crop shortages and more desperate job seekers as a result. Though the New Deal and other government intervention at the start of the decade did help stabilize the economy, provide jobs, help people with homeownership, strengthen the banks, and more, it was often meant to be very temporary. As programs ended and some aspects were reversed, things started to dip again around 1937. It wasn't as serious of an issue as the 1930 dip, but it was still a sign that things weren't going straight up, and there were still issues right around the corner. By the end of the decade, rumblings in Europe were also keeping optimism dampered. Colors, however, were not so shadowed. The lighter tones were even clearer than before, refreshing pastels, a term that has its origins in the mixing of pigments with white chalk rather than diluting them with gray or brown. Peach, orchid, powder blue, shell pink, and, no joke, elf green evoke playful emotions. Darker tones included a lot more pops of rusty orange, danger red, and lettuce green, but still kept some of the rose and soft blues of the previous decades. It's important to note that one of the key features of the early 1930s government efforts was getting more Americans into homes that they owned with achievable mortgages. Building houses was also a great way to help with unemployment. This allowed fashionable color palettes to be easily adopted into new spaces meant just for that style, not tempering heavy woodwork or fussy interiors, but fresh and colorful. So, is it that depression brings about a desire for cheerful colors? Maybe, but it was already headed that direction in the 1920s. So, at most, it could be that instability keeps pushing us that direction, or whatever direction we were already headed in. Honestly, the same thing goes with fashion. 1930 didn't have a sudden change. After all, even if the economic problems reach a global scale, many fashions have their start well outside of our borders. So let's keep going and maybe something will repeat or throw us a curve. The 1940s begin with the Second World War, which has dramatically different impacts in the US compared to Europe. There were shortages and make-do restrictions here during the war, but there was a huge economic boom after. As soldiers returned home, industry kept up speed and turned to non-military goods instead. Homes, appliances, cars, and so much more were available on a scale never before seen. Efforts to keep the inflation under control had worked well, so there was no repeat of the 19-teens. It was a tough start to the decade, but generally positive, economically speaking. Certainly more positive than the 1930s had been. And if we look very closely, there is a little bit of shift in the color palette of this era. Those lighter tones, which had been slowly getting a little more vivid, less gray or even white mixed in, were really taking over. Looking at 1940 brochures, most of the paints are creamy beiges, rose, or other soft tones. There's a few pops of color with peach, orchid, jade, and apple green, holdovers from that 1930s range. By 1946, softer versions of blue, peach, pink, green, and yellow are just as, if not more common than the neutrals. Follow this through to 1950, and they cranked everything up to 11. The colors aren't completely different, just more and more of them. The practice of complex layerings of multiple colors had stuck around from the 1920s, but now it was starting to be, well, a lot. This is a decade where the shift in economy, emotion, and colors is actually fairly clear. It was a transitional period for many reasons. Now, that doesn't mean that they totally left behind everything and started over. It's more of a refresh. The 1950s is probably the most positive decade we're going to look at. The Korean War did impact the early portion, but not in the same way as previous wars. The general economy, in most ways we measure, was rising consistently. The middle class was comfortable, growing, and establishing a new concept of what it means to be middle class. What that looks like became an important boundary as many new people were rising up, moving out to new neighborhoods, and social life once again started to change. In many ways, this is where our modern middle class becomes defined. As I've talked about extensively before, this is the era where they were so assured it would just keep getting better that they planned out decades in advance, and we haven't been able to break out of that mold. Color is amplified, but not chaotic. Instead of complex multicolor spaces, there's an increase in tonal rooms. 5 shades of peach or green in one space. Maybe one strong accent from across the color wheel. Everything is vivid, but not dark. No more watered down lighter colors either. We tend to associate this era with mint green, shell pink, aqua, lemon yellow, etc. for a good reason. Lots of products that had previously only come in plainer tones, like toilet paper, even picked up on this total saturation. Obviously, if I was just looking at this decade alone, I would assume that the cheerful attitude and colors go hand in hand. That confidence in the middle class, along with larger buying power, means that we'll choose brighter tones. Though that does ignore the things like colorful bathrooms and kitchens, both fairly permanent rooms in comparison to a painted wall, that had been common since the 1920s. Comparing the 1950s to the 1930s does show a different range of colors to some extent, but not an abrupt one, nor so much of a difference that they feel incongruous. Things do get much more hectic over the second half of the century, though, so we'll have to come back around to looking for larger patterns at the end. The 1960s is another transitional decade in many ways. Coming out of the 1950s, we didn't just suddenly hit the brakes. The biggest changes can be seen starting in the middle of the decade with the Vietnam War. A whole new, very large generation started becoming adults at the middle of the decade, being born just after World War II. They were raised in a stable and affluent time compared to their parents, and were fortunate enough to be able to actively look for something different. Major moments like the assassination of JFK, the Cuban Missile Crisis, ongoing Cold War, and more didn't affect the economic graphs, but distrust in the set standards of social life, the government, and other institutions rattled the middle class even without a major depression. It's another decade that shows a shift in colors midway through for that reason. Starting off with that same 1950s palette, it's not a stark difference. Some samples are a little more beige toned, not neutral, but warmer versions of the standard candy-colored range. This 1965 example adds Empire Gold, Tangerine, and Sandalwood, which completely changes the feel of the other colors, a trio that will continue to grow over the coming years. The rest of the range almost reverts back to that 1930s feel. Not dull, but certainly not as vivid. Spring green, yellow chiffon, and sugared peach feel like a misty version of the previous decade. It's towards the very end that a hint of the next trend appears, with the fully saturated colors showing up amidst the chiffon palette. So much like the 1940s brought us into the candy color tones, the 1960s ushered us out, both going through dramatic shifts in culture, even though the overall economy was generally headed upwards or stable throughout. For the 1970s, though, it all goes out the window. Interest rates bounced around in the first half of the decade, followed by skyrocketing rates in the second half. There were shortages with oil that caused a crisis in both 1973 and 1979 due to conflicts between Israel and Egypt, especially around the Suez Canal, where a major trade route is. The Iranian Revolution in 1979 would also have an impact, and the Vietnam War also continued until 1975. Big social progress was made throughout the decade with things like the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, expansion of the Civil Rights Act, equal education laws, and more. I guess add in the whole Nixon impeachment in 1973-1974 as the cherry on top of all of that. I don't have to explain much about how society was progressing on an emotional level. That's all a lot of chaos, and it doesn't even begin to touch on the cultural shifts in social life, art, music, and more. And yes, color trends cannot be denied as not being reflective of all of that. At the beginning of the decade, the lighter tones and that antique gold from the 1960s are joined by colors like Fiesta Red, Grape Sherbet, Avocado Green, and Royal Blue. This 1971 House and Garden color palette is aggressively bright. It's not fully primary colors, but it's a lot more than just the stereotyped rust, olive, and gold. And this variety continues through most of the decade. For example, the rock and roll paint with terrible puns for color names, which is absolutely my favorite of this entire video. It's just so bad. And it's not like the earlier pale tints disappeared. They're just a little warmer and are more often on the same palette with warm taupes, tans, and golds. What really gives us the visual of the 1970s and brown decor is all of the woodwork. What had been gradually disappearing since the 19-teens came back with a vengeance called paneling. And even though it doesn't show up in the paint swatches, it's still a relevant part of the look. As for what this means on an emotional level, it feels like a response to the remnants of the 1950s. The younger people who grew up in candy-coated kitchens looking for a way to break out of the standard middle-class mold. Resistance and chaos in its own way. I've also heard it presented that this was the rebound to nature after such a synthetic decade, which I suppose does also stand. Either way, conscious or not, it feels less a response to the instability and more that the instability was part of the response. A bit of an upheaval, though not always planned for how broad the impact may be. Though we think of the 1980s as the booming business decade, with power suits, shoulder pads, and the adoption of the digital world, it was far from the 1950s as far as growth is concerned. Inflation was being pushed down by extremely high interest rates, but there was still a recession in the first half of the decade, bringing unemployment rates above 10%. We wouldn't see that high again until 2020. Another small stock market crash in 1987 rounded out the decade. It was still an era with the Cold War looming as well. So it wasn't quite as chaotic as the 1970s, That same generation coming into adult years during that decade was now settling down with kids and office jobs. Less rebellion, more technology, more business. While this era is often depicted in color as Miami Vice, Beach Barbie, and neon spandex, home decor was, well, much more subdued in general, at least in the common middle-class house. This frosty range of barely there tints was much more likely to show up in the living room. Color doesn't immediately disappear, it just sort of fades. This 1983 example still has colors that harken back to the orange, gold, and green of the previous decade, just much softer. Summer Isle, Parfait, Lemon Mist, and Champagne. Entire palettes of neutral and barely there tints were produced as well. This is where my personal memory also kicks in, and I can say that the bright and bold version of the 1980s is more often from commercial spaces rather than home decor. Even if the decade started out with a rocky economy, the color schemes don't really reflect that. It's more of a gentle fade than a conscious change. The 1990s has a similar run with a little bit of a bump at the beginning, a small but official recession in 1991, and the Gulf War, but then things smooth out until we reach the end of the century. The dot-com burst, Y2K, and all of that will trip everything up leading into the 2000s, but that's not going to have an effect on most of this decade. Instead, it's a return to the middle class being shored up again. The baby boomer generation, notable again because of its size and financial power, has mostly settled down. The media is really pushing the ideal family, even if it is in sitcom format, and there's a return to that traditional social life. It's not a chaotic decade. This is also where beige in whatever variation of the time, almond, off-white, cream, etc., finds a solid footing. Color is not entirely gone from the palette, but it's returned to a much softer, paler, and toned-down range. Country blue, dusty coral, cameo beige, and flaxseed have fully left behind the vibrancy. A few pops of darker tones to round it out, like rainforest or pastoral red. Of course, you could always go with the Ralph Lauren collections if you wanted richer tones, all fairly warm and neutral as well. Finding paint cards for this decade was actually surprisingly difficult, as so many were historic-inspired palettes, which I don't think should be ignored, considering how reminiscent the rest of the colors are of the 1900s where we started. General Victorian aesthetics were a big trend in decor. Country kitchens, or Tuscan, with stenciling and sponge-painted walls sort of round out the trendy styles with those color schemes. This decade feels like it was one of the first to really refer back to another era though, which does speak to some aspect of the end of not just a century, but an entire millennia. Something that I don't think would have been a trend in an extremely bumpy decade, like the 1930s or one of only growth like the 1950s. Maybe if the same rhythm had happened earlier, the response would have been different. But there really wasn't anything in the 1990s that hadn't happened before. The middle class was able to ride things out fairly smoothly. So what does all of this mean in a bigger picture? In some ways, the easier story to follow might be middle-class stability. The economy, wars, inflation, and more rise up and down constantly, but they don't always have the deep impacts on everyday life. Sometimes social changes are far more interruptive. We socially go through decades where the status quo is threatened for a large portion of the population. Sometimes it feels like there's at least effort or control over that, though, and decades where we almost reestablish what normal is supposed to be before chaos comes in again. The 19-teens were chaotic and lacked much control, but when it happened again in the 1940s, regulations kept things on track. Even the 1930s had guidance throughout. I tried to look for decades that may have been similar with patterns of war or unemployment, stock markets, or emotional distrust even, but there really isn't one example that feels like a true repeat. And maybe that's why it's so hard to look for color changes decade by decade in that way. Zooming out, there's more of a gradual shift in three sections. Up until the 1940s, we retained a pretty similar color scheme, gradually becoming more saturated and dark. The big switch after World War II with fashion, lifestyle, and economy sort of started it over. If the 1950s aren't viewed as a just more vibrant early 20th century, but a new section that follows through until the mid 1970s, where saturation is the carry through, but the warmth level changes, that makes sense from an economic level. The most growth with the boldest colors. After that is a third section where color fades back out slowly. And we've kind of been stuck in that range ever since, which does track with the split between the wealthy who are fine with continuing in this era and the other 99% of the population which would like a change in all ways. Which brings us around to today, 2026, where after weeks of staring at dozens of color palettes, where, ironically, in the same palette as 1926, I actually directly pulled colors from the current predictions of major paint companies and overlaid them on this decor sheet, and it was so much more than I expected. I just knew that softer dark green was very popular around 1930, but did not think I'd find this much overlap. Now, do I think that this heralds a massive stock market crash in 2029? No. The things that led to that happening are so very changed. However, it may mean that just like the population emerging from war, pandemic, inflation, and unrest, we're trying to figure out where we go from here. We can't quite let go of the past, but we're looking for something new. But here's the thing. All three of the sections established a new path when the middle class reasserted itself with a new image. In the 1900s, we moved away from the darker and fussier styles of the 19th century, but also saw an era that brought the American middle class to the forefront of economic power, where the wealthy relied on them to be involved. The Gilded Age was at its peak and starting to fall apart. Picket lines and protests became the norm. Things got pushed forwards as unions were formed, and people took back a lot of that power. As of the 1950s, the middle class was at its peak and creating a completely new version of what that meant as thousands moved upwards into that classification. The 1970s was a new generation stepping into their role as the power of the middle class and trying to redefine what that would mean for them. But as the generation that should have taken over defining the middle class in the 20 teens, we didn't. There was a split between preservationists looking backwards and progressionists looking forwards. And honestly, part of moving forwards was sort of throwing off the mantle of middle class, a structure that not only keeps up the upper wealthy class, but also requires a performance to keep it alive when the economy threatens to kill it off. If you can't be middle class by income anymore, at least you can look it and keep the social respect. So it wants you to define what that looks like in order to survive. All to say, the middle class is struggling right now, both economically and in identity. So maybe that's what our muddled range of colors is telling us. We're ready for a new section of history, but we don't know what that's going to be just yet. And a reminder to download June's Journey using the link in my description and immerse yourself in that magical world of Art Deco.